Let's travel back in time to 5,000 years ago. Our destination is the Nile River in Egypt. Welcome to Echoes of History, where we dive deep into the past to uncover the secrets of ancient civilizations and the events that shaped the world as we know it today. In this episode, we'll take you on a fascinating journey to the beginnings of one of the greatest civilizations in history, ancient Egyptian civilization. How did it begin? And what were the circumstances that led to its rise? Join us to discover the story from the very beginning. Let's get started, because if you want to find where ancient Egyptian civilization began, this is where you need to go. But what you see here isn't what they saw. We can't actually travel back in time, so we're gonna have to use our imaginations. This will be easier than it looks, because no matter what you imagine, it won't be able to top the imagination of Mother Nature herself. This is the Nile. It snakes through the desert like a shimmering emerald jewel. Towering cliffs rise out of the sand, creating deep gorges which seem impossible to traverse. And in the distance, strange rock formations look like pharaohs watching over their domain. Because while there was water aplenty here, there wasn't much else. It was a harsh environment, unforgiving and dry. Yet somehow life found a way. Here along the banks of the river, small settlements sprang up. And in time, these would grow into small kingdoms. The most northern one we know of was called Upper Egypt, and the most southern one was called Lower Egypt. They were culturally similar, but politically independent. Their borders weren't rigid, and over the years, they would expand and contract as various local chieftains rose and fell. But even though the Egyptians of this period lived in small city-sized pockets of civilization, separated by hundreds of kilometers of inhospitable terrain, we don't think of them as isolated tribal people. That's because something very important had already begun to tie them together, and that was the process of unification. So, who brought Egypt together? Well, according to legend, it was a king named Narmer, or Menes, who united Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BC. Some scholars debate whether this figure is purely mythological or if he really existed. But either way, the legends tell us two very important things about him. First, his name, Narmer, may have been the first king of unified Egypt. And second, he may have been the first king of the first dynasty. The term dynasty literally means family rule. So Narmer was supposedly the head of a royal house, and whoever came after him would also be part of that same house. That system of government would become known as dynastic rule, and it's a key factor in why ancient Egypt lasted for so long. And fortunately, the legends also say that after uniting Egypt, King Narmer moved his capital to Memphis in the north, and that's pretty much all we know about him. So let us move forward a few hundred years to somewhere between 3000 and 2900 BC when we meet a man whose story we know much better. His name was Ahau. He was a member of the 5th dynasty of Memphis, and his reign marks the beginning of the Old Kingdom period. Ahau is significant because he is one of the earliest rulers for whom we have written records. In fact, we have his name carved on the Palermo stone, one of the most important pieces of ancient Egyptian chronology. It lists the kings of Egypt from about 2680 to 2180 BC, and Ahau's name appears near the top. Unfortunately, the stone has some damage, so we can't see too much of his entry, but it does tell us that he reigned for 40 years. The main reason Ahau's name has survived so long is because he did something pretty amazing, at least by the standards of the day. You see, writing in ancient Egypt didn't start with Ahau. Hieroglyphic writing had been used for centuries, but Ahau was the first person to use a type of writing known as hieratic. It was basically hieroglyphics simplified for everyday use. Even though hieratic writing started during the reign of Ahau, it didn't catch on until his successor, Teti, took the throne. Teddy was the first to use paper made of papyrus reeds, and he had scribes copy many important texts in this new style of writing. In other words, he created an official writing system for his empire. This technological leap forward allowed future pharaohs to record their deeds in writing, giving us a glimpse into their world. For example, one of the most famous pyramids in Egypt belonged to a pharaoh named Khufu. He was the fourth pharaoh of the fourth dynasty, and his pyramid is the oldest and largest of the three great pyramids at Giza. But while we know his name and that he was a pharaoh, we don't know much else about him. All we have are a couple of inscriptions on the walls of his pyramid. One says simply, "Khufu is pleased," which seems pointless unless you realize that to ancient Egyptians, the pharaoh was a god. And that inscription is a prayer asking him to be pleased. Another inscription says, "He who designed this work, and he who surveyed it, let them give ear. May they hear and live under the good pleasure of the king." That tells us two important things about Khufu. First, he commissioned the construction of his pyramid. Pyramids weren't built in a day, so someone had to oversee the project. And second, he ruled over a large area because he could demand that people be put to death if they didn't survey the land correctly. But what exactly was a pharaoh? The title didn't always mean the same thing. At first, it was just a generic term for king. But over time, it took on a religious meaning. Eventually, the pharaoh was considered to be a god himself. This idea was partly due to the Egyptians' unique view of their kings. And like many other cultures, they didn't believe that kings got their power from the people. Rather, the people got their power from the king. That's why so many Egyptian tombs are filled with treasure. When the pharaoh died, he went to the afterlife, and the entire kingdom suffered if he didn't have enough supplies to sustain himself on the journey. A pharaoh's tomb was essentially a gift to ensure the continuation of the king's soul. It's also worth noting that not everyone was happy with the pharaoh. Like any society, Egypt had its share of rebels. For example, towards the end of the Old Kingdom period, there was a guy named Herihor who led a revolt against Pharaoh Teti. These rebellions never seemed to last very long, and eventually they were brought to an end by a new title we see popping up during the reigns of the later kings, vizier. This was a position of authority that developed into a kind of prime minister. If you look closely at the Palermo stone, you'll see that many of the kings listed also have the title of vizier associated with them. The first vizier we know by name was a guy named Imhotep, and he served under Pharaoh Djoser. Today he's famous for being mummified and for being immortalized in a movie about the mummy. But in real life he was much more than just a tomb robber. He was the architect behind the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, the first major pyramid ever built. And speaking of pyramids, they weren't the only impressive structures going up during the Old Kingdom period. While they continued to be used as tombs for pharaohs, another type of structure became popular as well, the mastaba. These were flat-roofed rectangular structures that were often built for members of the royal court. As the power of the central government grew, the mastaba evolved into something larger and more impressive. By the end of the Old Kingdom period, these monumental tombs would become the norm for wealthy Egyptians. Now the Old Kingdom ended around 2180 BC and the reason for its downfall is unknown. But we do know that for the next 200 years Egypt was plunged into civil war and disorder. This period is called the First Intermediate Period. It was followed by the Middle Kingdom and then the New Kingdom. Now we could talk about those periods today, but to be honest, we'd be getting a bit carried away. There's just too much ground to cover. Instead, we'll bring things full circle by returning to where we started, the legendary founding of Egypt. We don't know for sure if King Narmer existed, but even if he did, his story doesn't explain how he managed to unite the kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt. Now we do have some answers thanks to the archaeological discovery of a site called the Pharaohs. There are several tombs here which date back to the First Dynasty. Most of them are small, but one of them, the tomb of a man named Y Dynasty, is truly breathtaking. It's huge and filled with priceless artifacts. Archaeologists believe that Y Dynasty was a local chieftain who eventually rose to become the vizier of King Narmer. If true, that would suggest that Narmer's rise to power was supported by loyal advisors. Other chieftains throughout Egypt would have seen this as an opportunity to rally their own forces and take over. So it's possible that Egypt was conquered, not peacefully, but by military force. In the end, it doesn't really matter because whatever happened at Abydos changed the course of history forever. It led to the creation of the first great African civilization. Thousands of Egyptians would follow in the footsteps of their ancestors and build one of the greatest legacies in human history. Over the next 3,000 years, they would produce countless works of art and architecture, make incredible discoveries in mathematics and medicine, and establish a culture that Westerners would spend centuries trying to emulate. But none of that would have been possible without the events of 5,000 years ago. Without the union of Upper and Lower Egypt, there would be no ancient Egyptian civilization. What's your favorite thing about ancient Egypt? Let me know in the comments below. And that brings us to the end of today's journey through the depths of history. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to support us with a like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story we've yet to uncover. Goodbye.